Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Just before the roosters found their voices in Abaddon, when the mist still clung to gutters and the night refused to fold its last corner, Martha rose from the bed the way a careful hand lifts a glass brimful of water. She did not wake Daniel, whose breathing moved in and out like the sea along Tarqua Bay, steady and oblivious. She wrapped a faded Ankara scarf over her hair, slipped her feet into quiet slippers, and let the corridor accept her weight like a trusted secret. Palmbridge at that hour carried the hush of a church before the first hymn. A lizard skittered past the doorway, a benediction of small things. She stepped into the kitchen where the aluminum pot waited, big-bellied as a proud ant, and ran the tap until the water stopped stammering. The matches flared, a firefly caught and persuaded, and flame licked the burner with a blue whisper. She set rice to soak, sliced onions thin as old paper, and lowered pepper into oil, letting the kitchen bloom with a promise of warmth. Her phone chimed once with a market woman's message about tomatoes arriving from Kano, and she replied with a thumbs up, then slipped the device into her wrapper pocket like a coin you don't want to drop. In the courtyard, the hibiscus wore dew-like jewelry. In the distance, a muezzin folded the morning into a ribbon of prayer, and the song floated over rooftops the way a soft scarf floats over a shoulder. Martha breathed in, tasting the morning the way one tastes a new soup, carefully but with hope. She told herself that days, like yams, are peeled one stroke at a time. She had learned to move slowly, the way a woman learns to carry a calabash on her head without spilling, and the lesson had become muscle and marrow, not performance but posture. On the living room wall, the clock made a calm, stubborn tick that reminded her of a drummer who refuses to rush dancers, and she smiled at the thought that time is often a stubborn drummer, yet even stubborn drummers must eventually bow to the music. By 7, the house had collected its noises, broom bristles gossiping across terrazzo, the kettle whistling the way Lagos buses honk for passengers, Daniel's footfall thudding a polite question down the hall. He emerged with hair that refused all negotiation, a clump of sleep still hanging on his lashes, and kissed the air near her cheek as if the air held her better than his lips could. He liked to talk about routes and invoices. She preferred to talk about how the light came through the curtains like palm wine through thin cloth, slow and strangely bright. They met in the middle, as couples must, on a small island of shared laughter made of burnt plantain stories, leaky roof memories from their first flat in Suralere, and the happy superstition that the first spoon from the pot belongs to the cook. Daniel told her his mother would visit after church, and the sentence bent the air like a hot afternoon. Evelyn could unravel a person's confidence the way a deft hand unravels a sweater, tug by tug, with a smile that said the thread had begged to be freed. Still, Martha ladled stew into a bowl big enough to persuade any stubborn appetite, and set plates with the quiet choreography that soothed her bones. In Palmbridge, people wore history like rappers, rapped twice, tied with a knot only they understood. Neighbors nodded through the gate and delivered news like weather. The Okonkwo boy had gained admission in Enugu. The pastor's wife's cousin had sent cloth from ABA. The traders by the roundabout had started closing early because of whispers about stolen phones and light-fingered boys. Martha listened, filed facts away as if her skull had useful drawers, and kept her voice low, aware that the loudest pot does not always have the sweetest soup. When she glanced at the sideboard, she saw her handbag, its leather softened by years and care, the bank card tucked inside like a sleeping gull. She picked up the bag and felt its small weight, thinking of petrol, salt, school fees for the neighbor's twins she sometimes helped, and the market list folded like a letter from a patient friend. She told Daniel she'd step out to the ATM before the day climbed onto its noisy horse, and he nodded, mouth full of bread, trust humming between them like an old generator. Temperamental, but familiar. The street was stretching itself awake when she walked out, the sky making promises it hadn't yet considered breaking. 2 boys dragged a bucket toward a tap that coughed and then remembered how to give. A woman balanced bread on her head, loaves warm as heartbeats under cloth. A man pedaled by on a bicycle with a bell that sounded like a nervous throat clearing itself. Palmbridge had a habit of looking like a smaller cousin of cities it admired, bits of Lagos swagger in its traffic, hints of Abaddon's patience in its shadows. She passed the tailor's shop where a mannequin stood naked and unashamed, a map of chalk marks across its chest like a teacher's corrections. The ATM by the pharmacy waited with its evergreen screen, a small priest in a metal cassock prepared to accept confessions. Martha slid the card in with a gentle push, the way one pushes a canoe from shore, and watched the options blossom. She requested cash for tomatoes, kerosene, a bolt of cloth from the woman who sold colors as if selling secrets, and a few naira more, because life always had a way of asking for one more coin. The machine blinked, blinked again, then announced its verdict with the polite cruelty of a bureaucrat. Transaction declined. For a heartbeat she thought the machine had misheard her, the way a distracted listener mishears a name, and she tried again with the patience of a woman teaching a stubborn child the alphabet. Declined. The word flashed with a smug little smile, and the air around her cooled as if the morning had suddenly remembered a debt. A motorcycle sputtered past, coughing blue remarks into the air. A little boy pointed at a stray cat that strutted as if its tail carried a flag. Martha swallowed, steady and deliberate, and stood as if she had expected the floor to move and was prepared to keep her balance. "So," she murmured, voice flat as a stone skipping only once, "the handshake has passed the elbow." She removed the card carefully, like extracting a thorn you'd rather leave for later, and tucked it back into her purse where its silence would not bruise anything soft. The pharmacist emerged to sweep dust into a polite hill and nodded. She nodded back. Nothing in her face suggested the ground had shifted, yet she counted her breathing. 1, 2, 3, as if lining up cups for tea that must be poured without spilling. She turned toward home, rice and stew spinning quietly on the back burner of her mind, and let her steps be slow enough to think and quick enough to keep doubt from showing off. By the time she reached the gate, a soft quarrel in the compound next door had resolved into the sound of swept floors, and the neighbor's radio declared that traffic near Ojota was misbehaving like a child with too much sugar. She pushed the gate and felt the hinge complain like an old man correcting a stubborn chair, then slipped into the courtyard where the hibiscus had already interviewed 3 bees and found them satisfactory. Inside, Daniel was rinsing plates, sleeves rolled, whistling a tune that kept forgetting itself. He looked up and saw at once that something had been taken off the table, though the bowls stood right where they should. "Everything okay?" he asked, because that is what spouses learn to say when smoke smells faintly of tomorrow. She set her bag down gently, as if any sudden movement might spill the truth, and said what was necessary and no more. The ATM declined. "I'll try again later." The sentence lay on the tablecloth with its shoes on. Daniel's eyebrows met briefly, shook hands, parted. "Odd," he said, and the word hung there like a coat with nowhere to be. "Maybe network," he added, throwing a rope to a weak excuse because weak excuses always wave back. She nodded and reached for the spoon, stirred the stew with emotion like a lullaby, and told herself there was no merit badge for panic. What was needed was the slow wisdom of a careful cook. Taste, add salt, lower heat, wait. She plated food and called Daniel to eat before the day spoiled their appetite with its surprises. In the middle of breakfast, a message pinged on the family group chat, Evelyn's weekly announcement that she would arrive after service, and expected the kind of soup that reminds a woman why she married into a family. Martha typed a small heart and saw the typing dots of a sister-in-law who had a knack for turning conversations into ladders she alone wanted to climb. She placed the phone face down, looked at Daniel, and decided the path forward would not be dragged by noise. In her chest, something quiet adjusted its head tie and sat up straight. She would move like morning fog crossing Third Mainland Bridge, slow, inevitable, refusing to be impressed by honking. Daniel had always been the kind of man who believed storms were only passing shadows, a little noise and then blue sky. He had grown up in Benin City where streets could flood in the afternoon and still be dry enough by evening for children to chase tires in circles. But that morning in Palm Bridge, when Martha quietly set her bag down after the failed ATM attempt, something in the air bent and stayed bent. It was not loud, not a clap of thunder or the shiver of an earthquake. It was the subtle change of a pot's smell when something has begun to burn, the kind you don't see until you taste it. She moved through the house that day with a measured grace, serving Evelyn's tea, answering Patricia's chirpy voice notes in the group chat with monosyllables, and keeping her face free of questions. Daniel watched her without saying much. He had seen his wife weather little slights from his family before. Evelyn's barbed compliments about her cooking, Patricia's needling about what a real wife should contribute to a business family. The casual way they often treated her as a convenient listener, but an inconvenient thinker. But this time, Martha's quiet was not the usual soft cloth, it was a drawn curtain. After lunch, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, satisfied with the bitter leaf soup Martha had prepared, and mentioned in her offhand way that some women forget their place when they handle money. It came like a pebble tossed in a stream, small enough to ignore, but enough to change the water's path. Daniel cleared his throat, but did not speak. Martha wiped the table, humming to herself, her melody a tune that didn't belong to the room. In the kitchen, while rinsing bowls, she felt the stillness of someone who has seen the trap being set, but knows the trapper is standing too close to it. Later that evening, when Evelyn had gone and the sun was melting into the horizon like red wax, Daniel asked her about the card again. "Maybe it's just the bank's fault," he offered, leaning against the kitchen counter. She tilted her head in a way that was neither agreement nor denial. "Or maybe," she said softly, "someone thinks the card is the key to the house." He frowned at her choice of words. "What do you mean?" Martha put the kettle on the stove and didn't answer immediately. The kettle began its low hiss, the kind that warns of a whistle, before she finally spoke. "Keys are funny things," she said. "Give them to the wrong person, and they will not open your door, they will lock it behind you." Her words were not angry. They were the even tone of someone laying bricks, one by one, building toward a truth. Daniel tried to laugh, but it was the awkward chuckle of a man who suspects he is standing in a room whose floorboards might give way. "If it's about my family," he began, but she cut him off gently, her voice a ribbon but with an edge. "If it is about them, it will not be because I invited them into my purse. It will be because they invited themselves." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, a man trying to decide whether to knock on a door that might open into wind. They finished their tea in silence. Outside, the neighborhood boys were playing football with a half-flattened ball, their laughter darting in and out like sparrows. The kettle, now forgotten on the stove, gave a tired sigh as the last of its steam escaped. The next morning carried the scent of wet leaves. It had rained in the early hours, and the earth was still holding on to the cool. Martha was at the dining table, writing her market list, when Patricia's name flashed on her phone screen. She let it ring out. Almost immediately a message followed. "Network issues. I had to handle some things at the branch. Your account might be on hold for a while. No apology. No request. Just that casual authority." The sentence was dressed as information, but carried the shoulders of a verdict. Martha read it twice, her eyes still and flat, before setting the phone face down. She thought of the way Patricia had smiled at her last Christmas, that narrow, tilted smile that seemed to say, "I know more about you than you'd like." She thought of Evelyn's knack for planting seeds in Daniel's mind, little suggestions that sprouted into quiet resentments if not caught early. In the living room, Daniel was tying his shoelaces, already late for a meeting with the transport company's drivers. She told him she would be going into town later, perhaps to try another ATM. He nodded absently, adjusting his collar in the mirror. His reflection caught hers for a moment, but he did not linger on what he saw. Martha knew that people often looked without seeing. She had built a life on deciding when to let herself be invisible. As she cleared the breakfast plates, she felt the first flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in years: anticipation. Not the quick, foolish kind, but the kind that sits at the bottom of a well, knowing that the rope will eventually be lowered and it will rise with the water. By midday, the sun was high over Palm Bridge, sharp and deliberate, as though it wanted to strip the roofs bare. Martha walked to the small stall at the junction, pretending to inspect yams while listening to two women talk about a neighbor's niece who had lost her job in Port Harcourt. Their voices carried both pity and satisfaction, the way people in small towns often hold news like a sweet they're not sure they want to share. She bought 2 tubers, not because she needed them, but because sometimes a purchase is a cover for an eavesdropper's patience. When she returned home, the postman was at the gate, handing Daniel a letter from the bank. He tore it open without ceremony, scanning the lines with a tightening jaw. "This is about you," he said, passing it to her. The letter was printed on crisp Heritage National Bank paper, the logo sitting in the top corner like a judge in a high seat. It confirmed that her account had been temporarily frozen, pending verification of certain transactions. There was no signature from Patricia, but her fingerprints were all over the wording. Martha read it slowly, each sentence a bead on a string she was determined not to drop. She folded it neatly, placed it on the side table, and looked at Daniel. "The pot has started to boil," she said simply. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting toward the door as though expecting his mother to walk in with another proverb about women and money. But Martha had already turned away, moving toward the kitchen with the same unhurried steps she had used at the ATM. The yams went into the basket, the knife into the drawer. Somewhere in her mind, the well water rose another inch. Daniel woke before the first rooster's half-hearted crow, stirred by a weight in the air that no breeze could lift. The house was silent except for the slow tick of the wall clock in the living room, but even that seemed muted, as though it too sensed something brewing. He found Martha already in the kitchen, her hair tied back, the faint smell of soap clinging to her hands. She was not cooking. She was simply standing by the window, looking out into the courtyard where a stray cat prowled with the measured pace of a thief who knows the guards are sleeping. Her posture was deliberate, not idle, and her eyes seemed to follow something he could not see. "You're up early," he said, keeping his voice light. She turned her head slightly, and offered a small smile that didn't travel to her eyes. "The day started before me," she replied. He lingered in the doorway, wanting to press her about the bank letter, about Patricia's boldness, about whether they were walking toward a fight or already in the middle of one. But something about the stillness in her made him swallow the questions. The kettle began to hum, low at first, then rising. She poured water into 2 cups, steam curling upward like smoke from a controlled fire. When she handed him his cup, her hand brushed his, cool despite the heat of the tea. "I have to go to Lagos today," she said simply. The words landed between them with the soft heaviness of folded cloth, but he knew better than to treat them as casual. "Lagos? Why?" he asked, but even before she answered, a part of him knew that whatever business she had there was not new, only newly necessary. "Some things can't be fixed from a distance," she said, taking her own cup to the table. She sat, sipped, and let the silence work on him. Outside, the morning gathered itself, the sound of a hawker calling out bread prices, the metallic cough of a Danfo engine refusing to start, the dull thud of a neighbor chopping firewood. By the time he finished his tea, she had already changed into a navy blue suit he had never seen her wear. It had the sharpness of something purchased for occasions that require answers instead of pleasantries. She didn't ask for his thoughts, and he didn't offer them. She simply took her handbag, adjusted the scarf around her neck, and told him she'd be back by evening. The taxi ride to Lagos was long enough for Martha to measure her thoughts against the road. Palmbridge's narrow, familiar streets gave way to the wider, restless roads of Ibadan, where traders lined the sides with tomatoes in rusty trays, yams stacked like patient soldiers, and second-hand clothes spilling from nylon bags in unruly heaps. The driver was a talkative man with a voice like gravel, and he seemed to think silence was a pothole to be filled. He told her about a fuel station in Abeokuta selling at a lower price, about a man in his compound who had found a python under his bed, about how Lagos never really slept but merely pretended to in the hours before dawn. She nodded where it was polite to nod, but her mind was a locked room he had no key to. When they passed through the outskirts of Lagos, the air changed, thicker, more hurried, charged with the restless energy of a place that believed every second was a coin that could be spent or stolen. She thought of Patricia, sitting at her desk in the Benin City branch, confident in the small power her job gave her, blind to the larger hands that moved the game pieces. Martha had not spoken to her since the network issues message, but she did not need to. Words were wasted on those who thought their reach was longer than it was. As they entered Victoria Island, the driver lowered the radio to point out a row of banks, each one gleaming with tinted glass and polished floors visible through automatic doors. Martha's eyes found the one she knew best, Heritage National Bank, tall and deliberate, the way a tree stands in the exact spot it chose decades ago. She paid the driver, stepped out into the heat, and approached the building with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged there in a way that could not be revoked. The security guard at the entrance straightened when he saw her, his greeting carrying a tone of recognition not reserved for ordinary customers. She returned his nod and walked inside, the air conditioning wrapping around her like a cool hand on a fevered brow. The elevator ride to the 10th floor was a slow ascent, each number lighting up with a soft chime that seemed to underline her decision. When the doors opened, she stepped into a hallway where the walls bore portraits of the bank's past leaders, men in tailored suits, women with eyes that saw more than they let on. Her gaze lingered briefly on one portrait in particular, Henry Cole, her late uncle, the man who had taken her under his wing before Daniel had ever entered her life. She remembered walking beside him in the corridors of the bank's Kano branch, the way he introduced her to staff not as my niece, but as someone you'll need to know. He had been a man of few public words but many private instructions, and when he died, his will had been a carefully written map. On it was her inheritance, a significant stake in Heritage National Bank, enough to make her voice unignorable in the boardroom, though she had chosen to keep that voice quiet. She had preferred a life where her power was folded away, like a wrapper kept in a chest for a journey that might never come. But the chest had been opened now, not by her hands but by Patricia's. She walked past the reception desk without being stopped, entered her office, and closed the door behind her. It was a room with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city seem small, like a restless child viewed from above. She sat at the desk, ran her fingers briefly along the smooth wood, and picked up the phone. The head of internal compliance answered on the third ring. "Good morning," she said, her tone calm but edged. "I need an immediate audit of the Benin City branch. Pay close attention to account access protocols in the last month." She paused, then added, "And pull all records related to Patricia Ellison's activity. I want a full report on my desk by the end of the week." She hung up before there could be questions. From her office window, Martha could see the flow of traffic on Ozumbambadu Avenue, cars and buses inching forward in a choreography of impatience. She thought of how cities, like people, often revealed their character under pressure, how Lagos's hunger was worn openly, how Pombridge's ambitions whispered in side streets, how Benin City's confidence came from its history rather than its height. The audit request would ripple through the bank quietly, but decisively. It would begin with discreet emails, move to confidential phone calls, and finally land on the desks of those who thought their actions were safe in the shadows. Patricia would not know immediately, but when she did, she would feel it like the first shift of wind before a storm. Martha leaned back in her chair and allowed herself one long, slow breath. This was not revenge, it was correction. There was a difference, and she carried it in her like a compass. She picked up a folder from the desk, figures, projections, letters from branch managers, and scanned them without real urgency. She was waiting, but she was not idle. She knew that in matters like this, the right pressure applied at the right moment could move more than force applied too soon. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Are you okay?" She stared at it for a moment before replying, "Yes. I'll be home tonight." She put the phone down and turned her attention to the skyline again, where the clouds were beginning to gather in the distance. Somewhere out there, Patricia still believed she had pulled the rug from under Martha. But rugs are only dangerous if you forget what's beneath them. Martha smiled faintly, and the city kept moving below, unaware that one of its towers had just begun to shift the ground. The news did not arrive with fanfare. It moved like a rumor through an old market, slipping under awnings and between stalls until even those who did not care found themselves listening. At the Benin City branch of Heritage National Bank, Patricia arrived one Monday morning to find the atmosphere unusually thin, as though the air itself had been sifted. Conversation stopped when she walked past, computer screens turned dark in unison, and the branch manager, who had always greeted her with two wide smiles, could not hold her gaze for more than a heartbeat. On her desk lay an envelope that seemed to hum with weight. She opened it with fingers that pretended not to shake, and found a letter. Polite but heavy, the kind of letter that smiled while removing a chair from under you. It informed her that an internal audit was underway, citing procedural concerns regarding account access, and instructing her to cooperate fully. Patricia read it twice, the words flattening her earlier confidence into a crumpled sheet. She knew her job came with rules, but she had always treated rules as bendable if one had the right company and the right surname. Yet here was a letter speaking in the bank's own voice, formal, distant, immune to her charm. She looked around the office and saw none of her allies meeting her eyes. Even the junior cashier, who usually hung on her every word, was suddenly fascinated by his ledger. The hum of printers and the occasional ring of telephones seemed louder than usual, as though the walls had learned to listen. She folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into her drawer. For the first time since she had paused Martha's account, she felt something she could not name. It was not guilt, not yet, but it was close enough to make her hands restless. In Pombridge, Evelyn was beginning to notice the cracks in her own certainty. She had expected Patricia's decision to tighten Martha's access to money to spark an argument in the Ellison household, to make Daniel question his wife's role in their finances, perhaps to loosen her grip on whatever small authority she had. But the opposite had happened. Instead of confrontation, there had been a strange calm, as though Martha had simply shifted her weight to a stronger foot. Evelyn visited the house one humid afternoon, carrying a basket of plantains and her usual air of practiced superiority. Martha welcomed her with the same measured politeness she had always used, offering tea and a seat by the window where the hibiscus leaned close as if to eavesdrop. As they sipped, Evelyn tried to steer the conversation toward the dangers of women handling too much money, but Martha only smiled faintly and replied, "Money is like salt. Enough makes the soup, too much ruins it, and too little leaves it tasteless." The remark, harmless on the surface, stayed with Evelyn long after she left. She had always considered herself the chief weaver of the family's social fabric, but she was starting to suspect that Martha held a needle of her own, threading in patterns Evelyn had never noticed. That evening, Evelyn sat on her veranda, watching the street lamps blink to life one by one, and felt the first twinge of uncertainty about the wisdom of letting Patricia act so boldly. She had not heard from her daughter in 2 days, and the silence was beginning to itch. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Martha received the preliminary audit report in her office. The file was thick, the paper warm from the copier, and each page carried the clean sting of precision. The investigators had traced several irregularities in the Benin City branch, instances of unauthorized access, unexplained delays in transaction processing, and most glaringly, the manual freezing of an account without proper authorization or notification. Patricia's name appeared in the log entries with a frequency that could not be explained away as coincidence. Martha read through the report slowly, marking sections with a pen, her expression unchanged. To anyone watching, she might have seemed almost detached, but inside, her mind was measuring the distance between cause and consequence. She did not feel vindicated. Vindication implied a battle she had sought. This was simply the unfolding of a sequence. She had predicted the moment she saw the ATM's rejection screen in Ibadan. She closed the file, picked up her phone, and called the head of the disciplinary panel. Her instructions were clear. The case was to be reviewed formally, and Patricia was to be placed on suspension pending the outcome. The voice on the other end agreed without hesitation. There was no room for doubt in the evidence. When she hung up, Martha stood by the window for a moment, watching the late afternoon traffic coagulate below. The city was loud, insistent, but her office was an island, and on that island she was the tide. By the end of the week, letters had been sent, meetings scheduled, and the quiet machinery of institutional correction was turning its gears. In Benin City, Patricia received her suspension notice, and though it was worded with the bank's usual professional courtesy, she felt the ground shift beneath her. She called Evelyn that evening, her voice tight. "They're making a mistake," she said. "This isn't about procedures, it's about someone trying to push me out." Evelyn listened, torn between defending her daughter and grappling with the possibility that Martha had been several steps ahead all along. "Come home for a few days," she suggested, her tone softer than usual. Patricia agreed reluctantly, packing her bags with the brisk movements of someone pretending not to care. Back in Palmbridge, Daniel returned from work one evening to find Martha in the garden, pruning the hibiscus with slow, deliberate cuts. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She looked up, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Everything is as it should be," she said. There was no triumph in her voice, no trace of spite, only the calm of someone who had set a wheel in motion and was now watching it turn. Inside the house, the kettle began to whistle, its steam curling like a signature in the air. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, sensing that whatever this was, it had moved far beyond his control, and that his wife, in her quiet way, had been steering it from the very start. Daniel's first sight of the Heritage National Bank building in Lagos was like standing before a truth that had been hiding in plain view. The glass facade rose without apology, the sunlight catching on its panels, as if the whole structure were aware of its own authority. He had taken the morning bus from Palmbridge, his mind restless, chewing over fragments of conversation with Evelyn and Patricia, and the small, careful answers Martha had given him in the past weeks. He'd expected the trip to feel like a rescue mission, an opportunity to get to the bottom of the misunderstanding about her account, but the moment he stepped into the lobby, the air shifted. It was not the kind of space that belonged to the confused or the powerless. The marble floors gleamed, the reception desk curved like a calm wave, and the staff moved with the disciplined urgency of people who knew they were being watched. When he asked to see his wife, the receptionist's polite nod was followed by the kind of look a person gives when a puzzle has just fallen into place. "Mrs. Cole-Ellison will be with you shortly," she said, each word landing cleanly. Daniel sat down in a leather chair that held him a little too well and let the name hang in the air. Cole-Ellison. He had never heard her use it, had never even thought to ask if there was more to her than the quiet woman in Palmbridge who knew how to make bitterleaf taste like a festival. Across the lobby, a large portrait of a man with a dignified beard and wise eyes bore the name Henry Cole. The resemblance was there if you knew where to look. in the set of Martha's jaw, in the unhurried calm that could fill a room without raising its voice. Daniel felt the floor beneath him take on a different weight, as though the building itself was letting him know that he had been living in only a fraction of his wife's story. When Martha appeared, she was not the woman he'd left at their kitchen table that morning weeks ago. She was wearing that same navy blue suit, but here it did not look like an unexpected choice. It looked like a uniform she had been born into. She walked toward him with a steadiness that left no room for small talk, and he stood instinctively, unsure whether to reach for her hand or simply follow her lead. "Come," she said, and it was both an invitation and an instruction. She led him through corridors where the carpeting silenced their steps, past offices with glass walls and the low hum of printers and conversations. They entered a conference room where the city spread out beyond the tall windows like an impatient sea, cranes and rooftops stretching toward the horizon. She poured him a glass of water before sitting down across from him, her eyes steady. "You wanted to know what's going on," she began, her voice neither cold nor warm, just precise. He nodded, the question stacked behind his lips suddenly feeling clumsy. "The short version is that your sister misused her position at the bank. She froze my account without authorization. And she did it because she thought I was just your wife from Palmbridge." The way she said just cut without raising its tone. He leaned back, struggling to reconcile the picture. His wife as a victim of petty family politics, and his wife as a figure in this building who could order audits and suspensions. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked finally. She tilted her head slightly. "Because you never asked. And because some things are easier to keep folded until they're needed." Her hands rested on the table, fingers lightly touching, as if holding something invisible in place. Outside, the city continued its usual clamor, but in that room time seemed to stand still. Daniel was aware of every small sound: the faint click of a pen from an office down the hall, the distant beep of an elevator arriving, the soft hiss of the air conditioning. "So you run this bank?" he asked, still feeling the words were too large for his mouth. Martha gave a small shake of her head. "I don't run it alone, but I have a significant say in how it runs. Enough to correct what needs correcting." Her gaze didn't waver, and he felt both the comfort of her competence and the sting of his own ignorance. "Patricia will face a disciplinary panel. The audit shows she violated several protocols. There's no defending it." He thought of his sister then, her easy confidence, the way she often spoke as though the world was a set of rooms she could walk in and out of without knocking. He also thought of Evelyn, who had stood behind Patricia's decisions with the certainty of a woman whose judgment had never been seriously challenged. "They'll be furious," he said. Martha's reply was simple: "Fury doesn't change the facts." She reached for her phone, tapped the screen once, and set it down again. "This isn't about revenge," she added, reading the thought on his face. "It's about making sure no one thinks they can pull strings they have no right to touch." By the time they left the conference room, Daniel felt as though he had been walking through a part of his marriage he had never visited. They moved through the lobby together, the receptionist offering them the kind of respectful nod reserved for people whose names meant something here. Outside, the heat of the Lagos afternoon pressed against them, the city roaring around their small bubble of silence. As they reached the curb where a bank driver was already waiting, Daniel glanced at her. "What happens now?" She looked ahead, her voice calm. "Now the process takes over. Patricia will be heard. Evidence will be presented. Decisions will be made." She paused, then added, "And we will go home." He understood then that for her, this was not the climax of a battle. It was simply one step in a path she had already chosen. The drive out of Lagos was long, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror while the road unspooled toward Palmbridge. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was about ordinary things: what to have for dinner, whether the mango tree by the back fence would bear fruit this year. Yet beneath the small talk, he felt a shift, a widening of the space in which they lived together. By the time the taxi turned onto their street, the sun was low, painting the walls of their house gold. As they stepped inside, the smell of hibiscus from the garden drifted in, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a strange, quiet pride in the woman who moved past him toward the kitchen, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a force that had always been there, patient, deliberate, and entirely her own. Panel convened in a quiet boardroom at the Heritage National Bank's Lagos headquarters, far from the everyday murmur of tellers counting cash and customers waiting with withdrawal slips. The room had the still air of places where decisions are made without raising voices. Martha sat at one end of the long polished table, her navy suit as uncreased as the first day she wore it into the building, her expression a mixture of composure and focus. Patricia arrived 10 minutes late, her usual briskness dulled by the weight of the moment. She carried a handbag that seemed heavier than its size should allow, and avoided looking at her sister-in-law as she took her seat. Around them, members of the disciplinary committee shuffled papers, their pens poised like small sentries ready to capture every word. The head of internal compliance began by reading from the audit report, the sterile language doing nothing to soften the blow. Unauthorized account access, breaches of procedure, and a pattern of decision-making inconsistent with the bank's code of conduct. Each detail landed with the inevitability of rainfall on zinc, steady and without pause. Patricia shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence unraveling thread by thread. When given the floor, she spoke of misunderstandings, of acting in good faith, of trying to protect family interests. But the room was not moved by appeals to blood ties. This was a place where rules were the only relatives that mattered. Martha listened without interruption, her gaze fixed, her hands folded on the table as though she were holding something fragile but unbreakable. When Patricia's words ran out, the panel members exchanged looks that spoke of decisions already leaning toward one side. In Palmbridge, Evelyn spent the day pacing her veranda, her eyes drifting from the road to the hibiscus bushes as if expecting news to arrive on foot. She had not gone to Lagos, Martha had not invited her, and perhaps, deep down, she knew her presence would not change the outcome. The plantains she had bought earlier in the market sat untouched in a woven basket, their yellow deepening by the hour. She thought back to the times she had dismissed Martha's quiet as passivity, mistaking her refusal to wrestle for a lack of strength. Now, with Patricia's fate in the hands of a committee she could not influence, Evelyn began to see that her daughter-in-law's silence had been less about surrender and more about strategy. She remembered the day she had remarked that some women forget their place when they handle money, and how Martha's reply about salt in soup had unsettled her in ways she had refused to admit. The neighbors, sensing that something was unfolding in the Ellison family, offered polite greetings laced with curiosity. But Evelyn, for once, found herself without the appetite to feed the rumor mill. She stayed seated as the sun sank lower, the shadows of the veranda's railing stretching across the floor like long, unasked questions. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleated, a child laughed, and the day carried on, indifferent to her unease. By late afternoon, the panel's decision was formalized in precise paragraphs and signed in careful strokes. Patricia's employment was terminated for breach of protocol, with the recommendation that her actions be referred to the National Banking Regulatory Body for further review. There was no dramatic gesture, no raised voices, only the quiet efficiency of an institution closing a chapter. She gathered her belongings with a stiffness that spoke of pride refusing to limp, but her eyes betrayed the heaviness settling into her bones. Outside the bank's glass doors, the noise of Lagos greeted her like a city unconcerned with her personal reckoning. Martha did not follow her out. Instead, she remained in her office, reviewing unrelated documents as if the matter had been no more than another task on her agenda. When she finally rose to leave, it was with the unhurried steps of someone who knew that real change was rarely accompanied by applause. In the elevator, she watched the floor numbers descend, each chime marking the distance between confrontation and closure. On the ground floor, she stepped into the heat, the city's chaos pressing around her, and signaled for a driver. The ride back to Palmbridge would be long, but she welcomed the stretch of road as a space to let the dust of the day settle. Evening had begun its slow embrace of Palmbridge when Martha arrived home. The air smelled of rain that had threatened but not fallen, and the sky was a canvas of muted gold and deepening blue. Daniel was in the garden, his hands dusty from tending to the hibiscus, the shears resting at his feet. He looked up as she walked through the gate, his face searching hers for the shape of the day's events. She gave him a small nod that said enough without words. They moved inside together, the house greeting them with the familiar scent of wood polish and the faint echo of the afternoon's quiet. She set her bag down, removed her scarf, and walked into the kitchen, where the kettle still sat on the stove from that morning. Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching her fill it with water. "It's over," he asked. "It's done," she replied, her tone even. He wanted to ask if she felt triumphant, but the calm in her face told him she was not measuring the day in victories. For her, this had been about alignment, making sure that what was wrong was set right, without the noise of gloating. As the kettle began to hum, she took 2 cups from the shelf and placed them on the counter. Outside, the hibiscus shifted in the evening breeze, and somewhere down the street, a radio played a faint high-life tune. They stood together in the kitchen, saying little, the air between them filled not with tension, but with a new, quiet respect. When the kettle whistled, Martha poured the water slowly, as if sealing the day's work with the simple ritual of tea, her movements steady, her presence as sure as the ground beneath their feet. My advice to you is this: never mistake quietness for weakness, and never underestimate the person who chooses to move in silence. Power that is hidden is often the most steady, and the one who doesn't shout may be the one who can change the whole table when the time is right. Treat people with fairness, even when you think they have nothing, because one day you may discover that they hold the very key you need. May wisdom be your constant companion, and may patience guide your steps so that you never fight battles before the right time. May your name be spoken with respect in places you have never entered, and may your enemies stumble into their own traps while you walk on clear paths. May the works of your hands flourish like a well-watered garden, and may no one's deceit or envy block the blessings meant for you. May your life be filled with peace that cannot be shaken, and strength that cannot be stolen. In every season, may favor find you, surround you, and lift you higher than you imagined. And so shall it be. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.